Funhouse for a wonderful paper. My paper will also be about 20 minutes, and it concerns later stage in accounts of the relation between the laws of nature and God. In particular, I'll try to clarify where Nietzsche thinks we must end up on laws of nature after the so-called death of God and why. I found that one really helpful way to understand where Nietzsche's views develop on laws of nature is to position him in relation to Spinoza, indeed following Nietzsche's own cues. And I'll mention just two such cues to begin, one more explicit and one more implicit. First, in the explicit case, you'll see in passage A in the handout that Nietzsche positions himself as a successor of Spinoza generally in this letter to a friend. Upon reading the historian of philosophy Kuno Fischer's extended treatment of Spinoza, Nietzsche proclaims that he's found his only predecessor. This is a relatively known text, so I won't dwell on it right now for the sake of time, even though I do think that it's still not well understood. And then second, in the relatively implicit case, Nietzsche develops a provocative and I think largely unknown response to Spinoza following his engagement with Fischer's text. So in that year and in the following year, you get an interesting move. Fischer had proposed in passage B that Spinoza's, quote, first thought was his equation of substance with God, with nature. And Nietzsche then suggests, possibly in dialogue with this point, with this claim by Fischer, that Spinoza's formula, God or nature, must be revised in favor of a, quote, chaos sive natura, chaos or nature. And it's this move, it's this locution that I'm going to try to shed some light upon now. In doing so, I have several goals. I'll just mention a couple of them. One is that I'm interested to shift the emphasis in some recent work by Nietzsche scholars like, for instance, Brian Leiter, who I would suggest does not take seriously enough Nietzsche's rejection of laws of nature, which he'll call in passage C a, quote, professed, if not entirely cogent skepticism. Another aim is that I'll also be interested, I also hope to put pressure on the notion of Spinoza as, quote, the most radical critic of anthropocentrism among the modern philosophers. As Yitzhak Melamed has proposed, I think he's right, of course, that Spinoza criticizes certain accounts of the laws of nature. So in passage D, for instance, Spinoza criticizes what Van Hau has helpfully called the voluntary choice conception. Spinoza writes there, I quote, "It's only because of the common people's power of understanding, a defect in their knowledge, that God is described as a lawgiver or prince and called just, merciful, etc." End quote. For Spinoza, God is not a prince who lays down the laws of nature. Indeed, Spinoza will even go so far as to criticize, I quote again, men who prefer order to confusion, as if order were anything in nature more than a relation to our imagination. These men also say that God has created all things in order, and so unknowingly attribute imagination to God, end quote. In short, I think that Spinoza's bark here is crueler than his bite, and in order to suggest this, I'll move to a second section of the paper on Nietzsche's and Spinoza's naturalisms, which will help us understand what views they share and where they begin to part ways. So for many commentators, Nietzsche and Spinoza are both naturalists in some sense, but as has, I think, become clear over the past decades of philosophical discourse in particular, naturalism is said in many ways. The kind of naturalism I'll focus on today is of a substantive variety, you might say. Spinoza, for instance, namely endorses substantive naturalism, or the view that there's nothing but nature, in passages like those cited in E, where Spinoza rejects the idea that human beings stand outside of nature, furthermore dismisses any, quote, any notion of a, quote, dominion within a dominion. Were there multiple dominions, human beings could perhaps have one foot in and one foot out of nature, but this is likewise a possibility to be rejected. And similarly, in passages like those cited in E, Nietzsche is going to endorse a kind of substantive naturalism as well. He's going to criticize the idea that there's a transcendent world. He's going to call for us to, quote, translate humanity back into nature. In line with Spinoza's rejection of any human exceptionalism, Spinoza then suggests, Nietzsche then suggests that, quote, a person belongs to the whole, a person only is in the context of the whole, end quote. So here again, there's nothing but nature. That's it. But naturalism is still going to be a promiscuous term, even if we specify it as a kind of substantive naturalism in this case, because nature is still a promiscuous term. And the key point that I want to make today is that Spinoza endorses a profoundly gnomic naturalism, law-ordered naturalism. We can call it a rationalist substantive naturalism, which Nietzsche ultimately cannot accept. So Spinoza is going to suggest, namely, that there's nothing but nature, that is to say, one lawful order. As Spinoza puts it in passage F, all things are, quote, natural things which follow the common laws of nature. These must then guide our understanding of those things. Or as Michael Della Rocca glosses Spinoza, quote, everything plays by the same rules. Nietzsche has to reject this rationalist substantive naturalism because Nietzsche rejects laws of nature. In two representative texts in G, for instance, Nietzsche decries the, quote, dominant mechanistic stupidity and mocks, quote, the conformity of nature to law, which you physicists are so proud of, end quote. Against Spinoza's rationalist brand of naturalism, then, Nietzsche rather embraces an anti-rationalist, indeed a chaotic alternative, what I'll call chaotic substantive naturalism, namely the view that there's nothing but nature, which is to say one unlawful disorder. So why does Nietzsche go this route? Why does he frame his view with reference to Spinoza, revising Spinoza's Deus, sive Natura, God or nature, in favor of a chaos, sive Natura, chaos or nature? And in order to answer that question now, I'll transition to section 3 on Spinoza's critique of anthropocentrism and anthropomorphism, which, long story short, I see Nietzsche to be drawing upon, doubling down on. So we have to get it on the table first. And I haven't framed things in these terms so far, but we've already seen that Spinoza rejects anthropocentrism. That is just the idea that humans occupy a central or even elevated status in or perhaps halfway outside of nature. Spinoza has to reject this as a straightforward consequence of his rationalist substantive naturalism. If there's nothing but one lawful order, then humans exist within that one order. And if humans exist within that one order in which everything plays by the same rules, then they can't be following their own rules exceptionally. And it's in this spirit that Spinoza criticizes in passage H those who, quote, believe that man disturbs rather than follows the order of nature. In other words, there's a natural order that includes and far exceeds humans. Most humans don't recognize this, however. They don't recognize their common status, and they instead imagine themselves exceptional. Insofar as they do that and then go on to interpret the world, they mistakenly engage in not only anthropocentrism, but furthermore often anthropomorphism, or thinking that existence is to be measured by alleged human existence. The measurement in question with respect to anthropomorphism involves now not just the erroneous evaluative gesture to consider human existence superior, special, and operating according to different rules and all that. That's the gesture essential to anthropocentrism, which should, I think, be considered upstream of anthropomorphism here. Downstream with anthropomorphism, we then furthermore make a descriptive gesture. We interpret non-human existence in alleged but ultimately limited human terms. And these all too human terms are limited now for two main reasons. First, they don't hold for us, they don't hold for humans, and second, they don't hold for non-humans either. Humans therefore make this dual mistake in descending from anthropocentrism to anthropomorphism when they imagine, for instance, that not only their doings, but even the world at large might be organized purposefully. Spinoza writes in this spirit of the foremost, quote, prejudice he wishes to undermine in the appendix to part 1 of the Ethics. I quote him in passage I, men commonly suppose that all natural things act as men do, on account of an end. Indeed, they maintain as certain that God himself directs all things to some certain end. For they say that God has made all things for man, and man that he might worship God. Most humans, according to Spinoza, fall prey to teleological thinking according to which things are for something, that there are ends in the world, purposes. One reason for this kind of thinking, which is misguided for Spinoza, who thinks there's nothing but efficient causality and no final causality. One reason that people end up thinking this way, though, is that they think they set ends for themselves. But according to Spinoza, we have to rule out that kind of thinking insofar as we've ruled out any anthropomorphic conception of God too, insofar as if he doesn't have ends, possibly even ends that are aligned with human interest, we're not going to have ends either, namely because God's the only thing that exists. There are no ends in God, there are no ends in nature. There are no ends that we set by our free will either. According to Spinoza, we have to reject free will on the basis of determinism and necessitarianism that Spinoza argues for on the basis of his rationalism. And so all of this kind of teleological thinking is going to, according to Spinoza, quote, turn nature completely upside down. For what is really a cause, it considers an effect, and conversely. These are ideas and interestingly, even locutions that Nietzsche will later echo when he criticizes, quote, confusing cause and effect as the genuine destruction of reason and worse. Nietzsche seems to appreciate, namely, this accusation of confusion in Spinoza, which is not exactly transparent. Spinoza suggests that it's quote, manifest through itself in the appendix to part 1 of the Ethics after he's put forward several of his most important metaphysical views, but it can be glossed. This set of moves and this kind of diagnosis can be glossed as follows. Take the example of my willing to drink water. I might think that I will to drink water and then subsequently drink water as a result. But for Spinoza, I confuse cause and effect here because I rather think, according to Spinoza, that I will to drink water because I am drinking water. When I'm drinking water and don't understand the true causes of my drinking water, and instead lazily attribute this event to the freedom of will that I don't really have for Spinoza, then in that case, I take the effect to be the cause. Remember, that's the accusation that Spinoza leveled, that I'm taking the effect to be the cause. And with that sip of water, I will go on to point out that Nietzsche really likes all of this, but he thinks that Spinoza doesn't realize the can of worms that he's opened. And to clarify that point, that claim, I'll turn in a final main section, section 4, to Nietzsche's critique of anthropocentrism, anthropomorphism, and ultimately Spinoza. Spinoza's repudiation of divine providence, his repudiation of teleology, final causes, the notion of ends in the world, more broadly, is quite unforgiving. Errors abound as humans misinterpret themselves in elevating themselves and misinterpret the rest of nature as a result. They, quote, posit a nature so limited that they believe man to be its chief part, end quote. And they infer from this, humans infer from this, that the world revolves around them or works as they supposedly do. They ultimately take refuge in what Spinoza calls, I quote, a sanctuary of ignorance. This is a terminology that Nietzsche will reference a couple of times in notes dealing with Spinoza. But despite this proximity to Spinoza, Nietzsche ultimately stabs Spinoza in the back, as I put it, as I like to think about it, in a move that can be glossed as Nietzsche's, quote, revenge of Enlightenment Naturalism on Enlightenment Rationalism, to use a turn of phrase that Robert Brandom offers in a paper on Nietzsche and genealogy. And to see Nietzsche, to understand how Nietzsche might be getting this kind of revenge, it's worth emphasizing the initial proximity of his critique of anthropocentrism and anthropomorphism to Spinoza. So compare, for instance, how Spinoza derides humans' view of themselves as the, quote, chief part of nature with how Nietzsche mocks this figure he calls in passage J, the realist. Nietzsche writes there in The Gay Science, "Before you alone, reality stands unveiled, and you yourselves are perhaps the best part of it." Nietzsche continues, "But aren't you two, in your unveiled condition, still most passionate and dark creatures compared to fish?" End quote. Humans are here imagining themselves to occupy some preeminent position, while Nietzsche suggests a comparison with marine life, again mocking the idea that humans reside in some allegedly exclusive human heights, proposing instead that humans might just as well rather inhabit the depths of the earth. Nietzsche goes on to challenge the anthropocentric, anthropomorphizing interpreter of nature. I quote, "You still carry around valuations of things that originate in the passions and loves of former centuries. In every experience, in every sense impression, there is a piece of this old love, and some fantasy, some prejudice, some irrationality, some ignorance." Nietzsche's references here to prejudice and ignorance again strongly echo Spinoza. As previously, humans are here carried away by their self-flattering biases. Nietzsche's injunction, as reads, I quote again, "Subtract just once the phantasm and whole human contribution from it, you sober ones, if you could forget all of your humanity and animality," end quote. Like Spinoza, Nietzsche highlights what are commonly the limits of our human ways of seeing the world, which Nietzsche reminds us are in fact equally animalistic ways of seeing the world in passages like this in The Gay Science, yeah. But Nietzsche arrives via this line of thinking at a surprising place. For Spinoza, we should eliminate our habit of overestimating ourselves and consequently misinterpreting nature precisely in order to grasp what turns out to be its perfectly rational character. Nature may not be oriented around ends with final causes, but nature is still organized in efficient causal terms, oriented around efficient causality with God as the efficient cause of all things. So here's now the twist. Nietzsche sees no reason to assume such a stable object of study, any kind of gnomic nature, even if he's pleased that it has at least been stripped of ends. So Nietzsche basically asks now, why, having dismissed final causes, not proceed through the other three causes too? And with no answer to this question forthcoming, and I think this is the key move, a kind of negative move here, Nietzsche accuses rationalist substantive naturalism itself of anthropomorphism, leaving him at his chaotic alternative, this chaotic substantive naturalism. Nietzsche therefore concludes the train of thought I was just exploring under J. I quote, "There's no reality for us," that's of course the royal we here, "and not for you either," end quote. In other words, grasping nature without human delusion means seeing that it's not limited to any bounds whatsoever, teleological or otherwise. There's no such there in the sense that there's nothing stable to point to, nothing defined by order whose lawful movements we might trace, so nothing definite, period. Nietzsche succinctly suggests, quote, contra Spinoza and his causalism here in notebooks, and I quote from passage L, that the belief in causae or causes falls with the belief in tele or ends, end quote. For Nietzsche in such radical passages, not only does teleological thinking erroneously inject human rumor into nature, but so does thinking in terms of the causal law that every effect has its cause, perhaps also the law that every cause has its effect. These are mere artifacts of a humane way of seeing things that, for instance, seeks comfort in regularity, which would give us a means to satisfy what Nietzsche derisively calls our, quote, causal instinct. This is the instinct to explain things and do away with our anxiety about them. In this way, Nietzsche thinks he can carry forward Spinoza's critical line, a major step, as he hopes in passage L, not just to, quote, naturalize humanity, but also to, quote, completely de-deify nature. Nietzsche aims, and this is arguably a way to understand the whole program really, at the, quote, dehumanization of nature. That's going to secure him a, quote, pure concept of nature, and he wants with that to pursue the, quote, renaturalization of humanity. So on the basis of this pure concept of nature, he wants to renaturalize humanity, but he has to get the right concept of nature in order to do that. Let's look at each element of this passage, condensing, I suspect, a great deal of Nietzsche's program. With regards to its first element, the dehumanization of nature is, of course, what comes out of the critique of the anthropocentrism that informs anthropomorphism. Dehumanizing nature might sound like a bad thing, but for Nietzsche, it's about getting rid of, overcoming our harmful prejudices. With regards to the middle portion of the passage now in L there, the program, Nietzsche is so wary of missing the pure concept of nature because of our prejudices that he's laid out, such that he's going to put here nature in scare quotes. He has to tread lightly because nature is commonly reified, conceived of, and mistaken all too human terms. As even when a philosopher like Spinoza criticizes others for their anthropomorphic tendencies, Spinoza will himself fall into the kind of error that he's criticizing, missing out on this allegedly pure concept of nature and rather imagining it to be characterized by a lawful order. So I quote Nietzsche, according to Nietzsche, the old God still lives in Spinoza, namely the God who orders existence, who is ultimately a kind of lawgiver. Despite Spinoza's efforts, he's fallen into that trap, according to Nietzsche. Finally, with regards to the final portion of the programmatic passage in L, so with regards to the renaturalization of humanity, one reason I'm interested in all of these issues is that this whole case for a chaotic substantive naturalism is, I think, going to feed into the ethical program that Nietzsche develops in a really important way. And when Nietzsche develops that ethical program in certain passages, he'll, for instance, position himself opposite, but I think on exactly the same spectrum as Spinoza. For instance, in the following appeal, this is also from Notebooks, I quote passage M, where he writes, "No more joy in certainty, but rather in uncertainty. No more cause and effect," again in scare quotes, "but rather the continually creative." In each case, I see Nietzsche opposing himself to Spinoza, who wants joy and certainty, who wants cause and effect, where Nietzsche wants uncertainty and this continually creative, this notion of the continually creative that would then be chaotic in character. So while Nietzsche is, like Spinoza, interested in becoming what we are within nature as we understand it better, that understanding is certainly not an end in itself for Nietzsche. And furthermore, what's understood is in any case of another nature, to put it that way. Nietzsche is then going to suggest, for instance, in the prologue to Zarathustra, I quote again from M, "One must have chaos in one to give birth to a dancing star," end quote. The chaotic world, in other words, is supposed to be the more liberatory one, according to Nietzsche, because it's lawless. That's supposedly going to allow for the more radical self-creation and self-expression that Nietzsche aims at. That dimension, that ethical dimension of Nietzsche's thinking, I think deserves more discussion than I can provide today, but I hope that I've at least reconstructed some of the ideas that feed into Nietzsche's ethics here, in a way that would allow us to discuss several aspects of his thought in the Q&A now. I hope that I've illuminated Nietzsche's relation to Spinoza along the way, and perhaps also shown some of the limitations of Spinoza's critique of anthropocentrism and ultimately anthropomorphism, at least as Nietzsche reads Spinoza, and that's something I'd be interested in discussing in Q&A in particular, among other things. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining, and I look forward to the discussion.